Tolerance is not individualized forgiveness. It is not the request to forget or to be radically empathetic. Tolerance is the minimum thing needed in any respectable society. I find it interesting that many online leftists seem to understand what people are meaning when they make assertions about systemic issues and how they impact everyone, namely marginalized communities, but all of that understanding flies out of the window when we see yet another example of one of the most ridiculous forms of racism pop up online. All of a sudden, it's only an individual fault, and the individual is the only one or thing that should be evaluated. And here's the thing, I mostly see this type of very emotional response from those not a part of the community the bigoted act was directed at. There seems to be an underlying belief that you cannot talk about the societal implications of an individual act because people assume you're attempting to defend the individual, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Recently, a photo of Dean, longtime friend of popular commentator Kurtis Conner, in blackface resurfaced. In this 2014 photo, he is shown in a costume of, someone, I don't know, with his skin painted a brown color to presumably resemble the actor he was trying to characterize. There has also been some resurfaced tweets from that same time period that showcase some homophobic, racist, and misogynistic predilections. And people talking about the biggest issue though, meaning the blackface, well, it's mostly not black people. And if that's surprising to you, I would beg your pardon. And before the arguments of, well, it's just liberal white people trying to absorb problems that are not even their own, hold on a second, we're gonna get to that discussion, but not yet. And not like that. I'm tired of the white liberals versus racially marginalized groups trope. It's been beaten to death, and I'm going to tell you why later on. Just let me build up to it. Using the left-leaning commentator Kuncan Dastner, or Duncan's, recent video focused on the controversy of Dean's blackface scandal alongside his critique of Kurtis's past defense of Dean in unrelated situations, as well as his initial reluctance to address Dean's controversies, we are going to explore a few things. We're taking it back to the basics and pinpointing the link between individualized and cultural forms of racism. We're going to dive into why many marginalized people don't talk about these issues in the same way white liberal people tend to, and we're going to critically analyze some of the conclusions came to and the advice given by Duncan through these lenses. If you are new to my channel, hi, you should subscribe. But I don't do deep dives. Instead, I create pretentious essay-style content around whatever insufferable online event is currently happening. Like many forms of bigotry, blackface has evolved from its heyday in the form of minstrelsy programs and flagrant dehumanizing caricatures of Black Americans.
Let that be a lesson to you.
What's the matter with you boys shooting up that man's hen house?
I'll shoot any chicken trying to follow me home.
Well, why don't you get a job and go to work?
You almost had me a job this morning.
Where?
Today, the term digital blackface is often used to describe the more subtle, in comparison, examples of what we're seeing today. At its core, blackface aims to humiliate Black people. It is typically an extreme show of a complete disregard to the group's humanity, if it was even recognized at all. The minstrel shows were unabashedly hate-filled and played on the violent disgust society at large held towards Black people. As overt racist behaviors like these shows decreased in popularity and acceptance, the more subtle, more ambiguous forms began to enter the spotlight. And this isn't just limited to blackface. For example, in certain renditions of West Side Story, white actors and actresses' skin tones were artificially deepened to pass as Puerto Rican. Aside from that, racist innuendos began to slide its way into comedy. The ambiguity of these situations relied upon societal acceptance of white people having access to any and all forms of culture, plights, and humor. There was and is a constantly pushed idea of nothing is sacred, and all of it has to be shared. with force if necessary. This is an almost ubiquitous belief under an overly individualistic culture, which reinforces the belief that no one person can cause or be a part of the substantial damage to an entire people group if they were not intending to. When I say cultural racism, I'm referring to the popular observation of both the United States established systems, doctrines, and people accepting and perpetuating theories, causes, and ideologies that constantly others. I'm referring to the the American default setting of white culture, despite America being one of the most diverse countries in race, ethnicity, nationality, and culture in the entire world. Cultural racism is a branch of both systemic and institutional forms of racism. All of these methods of racism inform and assist one another, making the postulations of where did this racism come from a very abstract and elusive question in modern times. Blackface spawned from and happened because of well-accepted racial stereotypes and separation. A cultural phenomenon does not gain popularity because it's the first of its kind. It gains popularity because its release touched the minds of many. Blackface and similar acts like yellowface or redface stabilized and normalized themselves not despite the American populace, but because of it. The fun thing about recognizing systemic issues is understanding that you cannot only attack the individual or the system. It must be both at the same time, all the time. Every time. But the attack on the individual cannot be imperceptive or categorically lasting. It must be constructively made and cannot be completely impassive to the individual's troubled state. Meaning, if your target is driving political change, a boon for growth must be offered. The many blackface scandals that popped up not only online but in media in the mid-2010s were not only unsurprising, but expected. Part of any culture, not just American or Western cultures, is to reevaluate past actions and course correct. And to do so, you need not just concepts to point to, but people. Online, we often utilize people as our playthings and examples on how to progress society. Shane Dawson was used as an example of what not to ever do.
My life got twisted upside down, and I'd like to take a minute, just sit right there and tell you how I became the prince of a town called Bel Air.
I don't know who that person is anymore.
Jenna Marbles was made into an example of the best thing one could do in response to past bigotry.
And then there's Roman, who's very...
All that matters is that people were offended and it hurt them. And for that, I am so unbelievably sorry.
And Dean is not only the internet's latest attempt of showcasing an example of what not to do.
My intentions at the time were in the nature of trying to have the most authentic costume possible, but clearly I was displaying derogatory behavior and was incredibly uneducated. This is something that I will regret for the rest of my life because it was nothing but racist. Black people are not a novelty. They are not costumes, they are not characters, they are human beings.
But what a public friend ought to do. But I'm going to use him and his friends as examples of what we can expect and how we can work with that. These three are examples of modern day blackface, and they range in severity for many reasons. The main ones being perceived intent, response, and hindsight bias. Because Shane has an online history that extends so far beyond bigotry, and at the time of his most recent cancellation, the platform's general leniency towards such actions had significantly diminished, his apology, no matter how or when it was delivered, would not have been accepted, because his intent in the act of doing blackface was already rightfully perceived as the most disgusting it could possibly manifest in on a mainstream platform. In other words, Shane's intent of the act was already cataloged from a hindsight's lens, so his apology was never going to make the cut, especially since he was entangled in present-day callous behaviors relative to 2020 and 2021. The phrase pattern of behavior is a perfect descriptor of Shane's legacy on YouTube. Jenna Marbles, on the other hand, was widely praised for her apology and subsequent exiting of the platform. The general perception of Jenna was an unproblematic creator who inspired many.
I actually freaking love her. I'm a huge fan. It's really important to note here, I think, that the underlying message of Jenna's video was not her being upset that she had to apologize, was not her saying she was being canceled. Literally no one was talking about this, like honestly, until she posted this video. And that's important to note for later. But honestly, overall, the entire video, I really commend her. I've known about her more not so great content for a long time. I probably watched it when I was a kid because I remember I watched Jenna Marbles when I was a kid. But unlike some of her other counterparts who also were creating content during that time frame, Jenna Marbles has genuinely shown growth.
She's had her controversies, but none quite as severe as Shane's many, many concerning behaviors. I don't believe many people actually perceive Jenna's blackface scandal as a true form of racism because of the context of her having a deeper tan at the time, which was made very evident by the removal of the pink wig at the end of the video.
But it looks like this.
Nicki Minaj last week. And then there's Roman, who's very...
And I do just want to tell you that it was not my intention to do blackface. This is the end of the video where I took my wig off.
However, I would still argue that this was a form of digital age blackface, which is described by Lauren Michelle Jackson as a descriptor of various types of minstrel performance that become available in cyberspace, and is later detailed as digital blackface does not describe intent, but an act of inhabiting a black persona. Jackson's descriptors surrounded the act of digital blackface in her 2017 essay, We Need to Talk About Digital Blackface and Reaction GIFs, in reference to the increase in GIFs and memes surrounding the mannerisms and behaviors of black people. The caricaturing of Nicki Minaj in Jenna's video, the way she speaks, the way she moves, the exaggerated motions, is what I would argue to be the blackface in her video, not necessarily the skin deepening. It's a component that can surely be argued, but honestly, it ain't that crucial. This is why it was important for me to sketch out the changes in blackface throughout American history. It is not simply the act of deepening your skin brown or painting it black. It's the body language, the motions, and everything else that is done to create an event around mocking black people. What Jenna did was mock Nicki Minaj. She mocked her cadence, her movements, all the things that are largely linked to a cultural distinction amongst black people. And for my devil advocates out there, maybe if Nicki Minaj was any other race besides black, no one would have cared. After all, it is very much accepted to mock the southern accents that are most prevalent amongst white people. But Nicki isn't white. She's black, and she resides in and is revered by a country with a heavily anti-black culture. Because of that specific context, the argument of hypocrisy will never be enough. Systemically, one person of the majority racial group, in this case a white person, taking it upon themselves to mock another white person, or a marginalized person mocking another marginalized person, will never have the same wayward effects as a white person mocking a member of any marginalized racial group. The latter reinforces a cycle of separation that forcibly wills the marginalized to concede, as in to say, we can pretend that we're equals legally, but culturally, you know where you belong. As racism takes on subtleties, it becomes harder and harder for marginalized people to exactly pinpoint it and link it back to a systemic structure. This is partially why many marginalized groups, particularly Black Americans, have taken on the value of you choose to be offended.
This attitude that's become pervasive in our society is the problem. Because people feel entitled to never being offended, to never seeing anything offensive, they see something that they deem is offensive and therefore feel like their outrage is justified. Here's the reality.
Go ahead.
When we tell college and young people that they don't deserve to be offended, they grow up to be weaker adults. Because they grow up to think that the world is meant to be this 100% acceptable place where we all drive on the same ideas, but that's not the reality of the world.
It's a defeatist narrative that forces responsibility back onto the Black community for being offended in the first place. And here's the thing about this. There's a difference between being offended and recognizing something as offensive. You will seldom see me, offended by something because I typically require a personal stake in you in order for me to reach that threshold. And that is a mentality that most people have. However, I can see when something is offensive and plays into the institutions that exist around us. Many Black people don't give a fuck about what random white influencer number 92 is doing. We've seen it all before. You are not special. Therefore, you will need to explain to me why I should care. That is the mentality I'm describing here. Many of you have forgotten that Black Americans are Americans. We have internalized the very same individualistic mindset as our white and brown counterparts. Communal within the culture, sometimes, but individualistic outside of it, always. This is actually exemplified in some of the creators' responses to General Marvel's self-cancellation 3 years ago.
I totally remember this. Do you see how I'm smiling? Do you see how I'm smiling? I'm smiling because I remember it being funny and being like I remember being in my room and seeing that, and like I again, I wasn't, and maybe I should have been like, what she's doing blackface, like, oh my god, this is terrible. But that just wasn't the energy at that time. And like, there are gonna be people who were a different age at this time. I was literally like the end of high school at this time. Okay, like 2011, I was like literally done with high school. So,
but I do want to tell you how
man.
unbelievably sorry I am if I ever offended you by posting this video or by doing this impression. And that was never my intention.
I feel bad because she did not offend me.
It's shameful. It's awful.
Maybe I should have been offended, but I wasn't.
Part of my past. Here's a clip. I'll play it for you. Here, hold on. Let me remind you.
Okay, hold up. Pause. I don't think I've seen this one. Pause. Okay, so I know I fell off of the Jenna Marble train, so I don't think I've seen this video. I think she's acting like she's like a here, or Chinese, or...
First two things that I would like to address is the fact that there are people that were offended that I did blackface as Nicki Minaj in 2011, and I'll show you the clip. It's incredibly cringy and embarrassing. This is...
I hate that she's even showing it after privating it, like, and putting it in this video.
It looks like this. And I do just want to tell you that it was not my intention to do blackface. This is the end of the video where I took my wig off. I don't know how else to say
like,
this.
That wasn't even a thing then. Can we talk about the fact that blackface didn't even exist until, like, people are just always coming up with stuff to be offended by. It literally grinds my gears. I can't.
These two ladies don't bat an eye at the overtly racist act levied at Chinese people.
So what's the problem with this video now?
And did not perceive Jenna's Nicki Minaj impersonation as an offensive act because they were not personally offended. It's a self-focused, self-centered attitude that many online leftists will have you believing does not exist within marginalized communities. But this is the kind of callousness that I've been made privy to in many marginalized groups. This type of attitude could also serve as a protective barrier between the person and life as it is. It can be suffocating to constantly grapple with the racism that has become so normalized around you to the point where it becomes easier for you to just deny it and refuse to see it. The point of relaying these things to you guys is to get you to really understand that Black people are not a monolith. We disagree. We argue with each other, and some of us think others are too sensitive or too quick to condemn. Because of this, I always lean more into establishing a societal link to this type of pop prejudice, rather than relying upon my own emotions or speculating on the feelings of other Black people. Because that is my preference, I always find videos like Duncan's to be very odd.
But blackface itself is a hard stop. There's no conversation to be had there. There is not one redeeming quality in that act, and you have to know that if we're going forward. If a single one of you tries to defend or excuse blackface in the comments, be it in any context, used in any time, I don't care if you are trying to defend the person you love. Just know that you do not represent what this channel's values are, and you do not belong in this channel's community. I want nothing to do with you, and I won't think twice about it, because you're not worth keeping around.
It's such an overly emotional response. It reminds me a bit of Noah Sampson's critique video of Patience Zena on her take about the recent Little Mermaid movie. It was odd to see someone who was not a part of the group targeted to combat so heavily against someone that is. I did make a video with significantly worse editing than my current content. It's not that I believe Patience is beyond critique simply because she is Black. I've literally made a video about her myself, but not from that angle. I would never presume it's my place or anyone else's to determine what good representation feels like for an individual. In relation to Duncan's assertions surrounding Dean, he fully condemns Dean's past actions and did not view his apology as genuine. He also stated the following.
The secrets of the past that will destroy someone's career will come out, because they just will. They always do. And if you know you've done this horrible thing that would potentially ruin your career in the public eye, you always have the option not to be an influencer or, someone who's trying to gain the trust of an audience, someone whose face is the product. If you have a past of edgy comedy that is bad, maybe take a job in backstage, or maybe you ghostwrite for someone, or maybe you are part of a team that does influencing, but you're just not at the forefront. You should still be doing reparations, but you just don't have to say why. If you did something bad, you should atone for it. And you can do that without all of this public humiliation.
This stood out to me as abnormal because on an individual scale, it doesn't make sense. On a societal scale, it seems to make sense until you think a bit further than your hurt feelings. Not only does the idea that if you did something prejudiced in the past, then you should never make your face your business or brand. If you lead with that kind of practice, it not only prevents people from analyzing and pointing to specific instances of how different forms of racism still very much exist, but it also can hinder that person from being criticized, which can subsequently lead them to inputting their unchecked biases into whatever media they're assisting in the creation of. This may be a highly controversial take. I hope that it's not, but I don't generally believe a bigoted person is beyond reform or redemption, depending on their actions. The caveat here is, who should be tasked with helping that reform take place? Should it be the people from the group that was the target of their bigotry? Or should it be everyone else? The former relies on the foolhardy thought that a people group has enough of a similar stance individualistically. The latter has the same fallacy, but it also comes with the assumption that everyone else has a genuine care. You could say that it's the individual person's responsibility to reform themselves, but you'd be neglecting that the reason why many people in the early and mid 2010s have had so many scandals with bigotry of all kinds because they uncritically accepted and acted upon the culture around them. Most present-day creators accept and act upon the culture that is around them. Duncan is a great example of this. His video is what many online leftists in 2016 to 2018 were vying for. An apologetic white person who was willing to take what they've learned about inequalities and apply it to online or real-world examples. He has all the talking points down, right? Listen to black people, unambiguously condemn the person who did the racist thing, and say that there's no nuance in blackface, which I actually do disagree with, but contextually, I understand his point. But I and many other marginalized people have always cringed at this sort of thing because the amount of guilt people like Duncan seem to carry is uncomfortable to witness.
It means the entire time you've been known, you're guilty. And every version of you that's ever appeared on camera or heard on audio is someone who deep down knows about this thing that they did and is hoping that nobody finds out and is just coasting on that hope. But you're guilty.
And I don't mean guilt by way of I'm speculating that he did something bad in his past and he's trying to atone for it. After all, he directly told us that this is not the case.
But I can't lie. When my subscriber count was going up, and the fantasy of doing this as a career was floating in my head, and potentially that number rising and rising, I tried to think about if there was anything in my past that would bring down a career like that. I racked my entire memory trying to think of if I had offended anyone, or if I had accidentally said something, or said a word, or if there was any evidence someone could bring up, like stuff I know doesn't exist, but on the off chance that I forgot, I just tried to remember so hard. In the end, I couldn't think of anything. I avoided slurs all my life. I avoided parties on accident all my life. I was a homebody. I had a very, very clean slate. Whatever fantasy of a future career I had was safe. I was kept away from any opportunities of offending or doing any harm. I was nowhere near places where I could be negatively influenced into making those kinds of decisions. I had my small little friend circles, and if anyone said anything racist or derogatory, I'd remove them from my life because my parents raised me by those values, and so that was the system I trusted.
Even though he'd be relying only on his own personal perception of what is offensive and what is not, and if the internet has taught us anything, it's that we don't always understand why or how something could offend. And it also indicates under his ideology, the only way to ethically have a platform based on yourself is to be born into the right circumstances, i.e. having good principled family and friends and a lack of opportunity to make a mistake. But that's neither here nor there. I mean it as in an irrational form of guilt that shows remorse for the position that you were born into. So being born white. We don't do white guilt on this channel. Be more critical and intentional than falling in on yourself because you are white. If nothing else, I appreciate that Noah in his video on patience unapologetically stood his ground on his principles without presence of white guilt. I still believe he was off base, but I've grown tired of the racial divide in conversations. Not just the divide that makes it very hard for white people to transverse in the waters of race, but the divide that makes it tangibly harder for anyone to fully disagree with someone else from another racial group. For what I see, this is mostly a chronically online, young lefty thing to do, and I can see people actively shifting away from it, and that's a great thing. That type of logic provides people an undeserved out when they feel unable to voice their opinions on a topic outside of themselves. We can no longer critically engage with one another when that type of logic becomes prevalent. So even though Duncan's video is adhering to the still existing but reducing online culture of creating content around racial issues with this very emotional tone, it is a culture that will not last. So in the future, when people discuss videos like Duncan's, and someone with more radical viewpoints stumbles upon it with the same all or nothing mentality Duncan is exhibiting here.
If you preach goodness, and then something dark is brought up from your past, you've suddenly lost all credibility in everything you've ever said.
Should future audiences condemn him? I know some of you are thinking, well, Justice, Duncan didn't do anything wrong, so why would he be condemned? I may not currently believe that Duncan did something wrong here, and you may believe that too. Similar to how Dean, Jenna, and Shane's audiences did not believe they did anything wrong in the 2010s while they were making that content. But online culture changes rapidly, expeditiously, and frighteningly. I don't believe content in the present day should be made with future analyses in mind, but if Duncan's all or nothing sentiment grows in pervasiveness online, that proclivity will become a normative. And personally, I don't want that, because it removes authenticity of thought, which will disallow us from deeply understanding the present day culture thoroughly. This was never a question of should offensive content be allowed to exist. It should always be the question of how do we reduce people's desires to create offensive content? Or how do we make them understand their implicit biases before the offensive content is even created? The first question is an ideal. The latter two are root cause analysis and cause prevention. One of the biggest points made in Duncan's video was trying to determine when your friend's actions become representative of your own values. Dean's being a friend of Kurtis is really the reason why the scandal became so popular. The girlies are wondering why Dean would keep a friend who has done this, amongst other things that people have found to be questionable, when he has built his entire platform on values of inclusion, feminism, and anti-racism.
I consider myself a fan of Kurtis Conner, you know, a citizen of Kurtis Town. And I am very disappointed that Kurtis has not said anything about this. I do think that he's seen it though, because the videos that he did have with Dean on his channel have since been deleted. It's just discouraging seeing a creator that you believed had good values associate with someone like this and continue to associate with them through those tweets, through the blackface. They were friends through it.
The kids are wondering if it represents an inconsistency in his values, if he truly believes in the causes that he has preached for. During the most recent Shane Dawson cancellation, I felt a lot of abject disgust for creators and audience members who were previously aware of his past actions. Not necessarily the racist parts of it, but the child predator-like undertones to his content. If you've watched Shane while he was doing blackface, then you've watched him when he was blatantly exploiting children. And to be clear, if you hurt children in any way, you are classified as irredeemable in my book. In my video on Colleen Ballinger, I talk a lot more about the cultural acceptance of child exploitation in multiple forms more extensively, but my point right now is, I had to take a step back from that discuss and look at the bigger picture. How could I expect better from people when I wasn't allowing them to be better? I wasn't allowing them to come to terms with the fact that they uncritically accepted this vile man as one of their go-to YouTubers and dealing with the confliction between their spoken values and their actual actions. It is only in the wake of confronting your own confinement where we can truly see where a person's values lie. What will they do when it's them on the chopping block? Will they run from criticism? Will they just give up and stop trying to be better? Will they deny all accusations of the space they've created not being one of positivity and viciously proceed? Or will they grow in their own time? And moreover, will you stick around to have those questions answered? I certainly won't. There's too many great creators on this platform to waste my time wondering what one person is gonna do. No creator is irreplaceable to me, including myself. I'm also more nihilistic in my philosophy, so I rarely believe people genuinely change based on constructive criticism given to them by strangers. I just believe they get better at hiding. Change typically seems to only occur over a long period of time through personal interactions and experiences. But everyone isn't like me. Some people care more, whatever the reasons for that care may be, and they will stay. They will write it out, for better or for worse. So where does that leave Kurtis? Well, Kurtis has already made his peace and addressed his audience. He has chosen his values over his friend, at least publicly, and that's all that really matters when it comes to his online persona. If that statement doesn't make sense to you, riddle me this. One of the most pervasive examples of casual racism and insensitivity is putting on an indigenous tribe's headdress or wearing a sombrero with a thick mustache and calling them costumes. We could also point to the gypsy trend where Westerners thought it was cute to dress up like a gypsy, all the while ignorant to the mistreatment and continued marginalization of Romney people. I'm willing to bet that someone in your life has done something like this or has done something akin to it. Would you X that person out of your life? Or would you rely on your preconceived positive notions of this person and try to help them understand why these things can be considered offensive? Unless you are radical to the point of absolute fault, I'm willing to bet the latter. I'm willing to bet that because you would know better than anyone else if that person is more than their ignorance, more than their uncritical natures, more than their casual racism and xenophobic actions. I talk about parasocial relationships a lot because I find them to be one of the root causes as to why people often pretend online they can't view other people as people. These folks' relationships are built upon ego and projections. Our favorite influencers are not our favorite influencers because we value their creations. They are our favorite influencers because there's a laissez-faire ownership that we've inflicted upon them that is encouraged by them. And that ownership was created because we've projected our emotions, our principles, our thoughts onto them. And when that illusion is broken, when they deviate from your expectations, some people get very vicious. There are genuine and well-deserved boundaries to that kind of framework though. I wouldn't necessarily expect someone to look at Dean and be like, well, Dean was just a person who made a mistake. No, Dean is a symptom and a consequence of a much larger scale issue that many people who have actively participated in the standardization of casual racism now want to pretend like they were never a part of that because they themselves never did anything that was that far over the invisible arbitrary line of redemption. However, I would expect I wouldn't expect it, but I would prefer it. I would prefer for people to look at Kurtis as someone who is probably trying to assist his friend offline to understand the why. So the people group targeted don't have to drive conversations that rarely surmount in true change in the individual person's character. And that, my friends, is the paradox that exists with white liberal people and online leftist identity politics. White liberal people are expected to learn from the marginalized in order to understand how issues systemically affect other groups outside of themselves. Identity politics, ideally, exists to forcibly create a more holistic image of where our society systems fail and have blind spots. People of different identities are often affected differently and more severely than people of other identities, so it's important to evaluate all those different and sometimes intersecting perspectives. But like most things, the internet has completely bastardized this concept. And it has also left a very unsure space for white liberal people to exist in. If you're a Kurtis with a dean in your life, my assumption would be that you would attempt to help your dean as friends do. Friends are there in part to help you grow and to help you learn, but it seems that's no longer widely acceptable, at least not online in the public sphere. It may seem hardcore, ultra-liberal, or based to say something like, I'm not tolerating anyone who has done these types of actions, but if everyone in your political faction has that same way of thinking, where does that leave social progress? Tolerance is not individualized forgiveness. It is not the request to forget or to be radically empathetic. Tolerance is the minimum thing needed in any respectable society. You practice tolerance every single day, but for some reason, when some scallywags come online, all of a sudden, it goes out of the window. Similar to how conservatives tend to remove all blame from a governing entity and push it onto individuals, online progressives tend to push all responsibility onto intangible concepts except for when it's convenient for them. I don't find it helpful to act like people are demons when they participate in casual racism, or to act like you yourself have always been above it. We've all been kids, adolescents, and more importantly, ignorant. If you claim to be a political person who sees all things as political, then challenge yourself to understand that the concept of tolerance does not mean excusing or accepting bigotry. It simply means you understand that there's a direct pathway forward, even if you don't want to be the one doing the hand-holding. And that's all that I have for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.